this material to be posted on the Urban Good Practices website. So with this, let me hand the presenters right now to the GIPS team.
Hello?
Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. So welcome to this webinar from the Joint IDP Profiling Service, or GIPS as we're commonly known, on the subject of the profiling of displacement in urban contexts. We're very pleased to be able to discuss this topic with you today, and we'll be doing so while looking at one case study from our recent work supporting an urban profiling exercise in Hargeisa, Somalia. So this webinar will involve a presentation and a question and answer session towards the end. But if you'd like to ask a question at any time, then please do type a message using the chat function, and we'll try to address this during the session or at the end. So just to introduce myself, my name is Emmanuel Souberan, and I'm the Training and Capacity Building Manager at GIPS, based in Geneva, and I'll be doing the presentation part of this webinar. We also have Laura Ronkainen and Damien Giselle, who are profiling advisors at GIPS here in Geneva, and also Kadra Elmi from the Danish Refugee Council in Somalia, and they'll be available for the question and answer session later on. So I'll just give a quick introduction to GIPS, the Joint IDP Profiling Service. We're an interagency service, which is a joint project that was set up by various United Nations agencies and non-governmental organizations to provide technical support at different phases of the profiling process. And we're co-hosted by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and the Danish Refugee Council, with an executive committee made up of different agencies that helps us set priorities and identify which profiling exercises we support. So we also hold a number of trainings and work with partners to build up their capacity for undertaking profiling exercises. In recent years, GIPS has been more active in supporting profiling exercises in urban contexts, recognizing the need to develop adapted approaches to profiling in urban settings. And based on our experiences, we developed a guidance document on profiling urban displacement situations that was published in June 2014, which you can find on our website. A lot of the content from this webinar will draw on this work. So for the structure of this webinar, we'll look in a minute at what profiling is and what the profiling process entails before moving on to cover urban challenges and why profiling can help to address these. After this, we will introduce the project in Hargeisa, Somalia, that GIPS has been supporting, and then we will touch on collaboration before getting into the details of mapping out our baseline and sampling in urban contexts. We'll also present some of our findings from Hargeisa and have some time for questions at the end. So now we're going to talk about profiling. Profiling of displacement situations is a collaborative process of identifying and gathering information on both the displaced and displacement-affected populations in order to advocate on their behalf and help bring about a solution to their displacement. A profiling exercise can be undertaken for a number of reasons. Could include a lack of outdated or contested population data, which is needed for advocacy or for planning and provision of assistance. It could be a lack of information about hidden or hard-to-find displaced population groups. So, for example, the unregistered or the undocumented. Could be to do with a lack of disaggregated and or comparative data about the geographic distribution and situation of population groups. Perhaps refugees or IDPs or migrants, locals, that are needed to identify specific vulnerabilities. Or it could be about a lack of cross-thematic profiles of the experience and intentions of different displaced groups needed for sectoral programming or monitoring and advocacy, especially concerning durable solutions. So one of the key differences between profiling and other data gathering exercises is that profiling is premised on and prioritizes collaboration between different actors concerned with the displacement situation. Optimally, the need for profiling is not established by a single organization, but by a group of organizations that jointly initiate a profiling exercise. A profiling report provides a comprehensive picture of the population studied by the exercise, including demographics and indicators about strengths and vulnerabilities, maybe the degree of local integration and potential plans for return or onward movement, and it's thus well placed to inform, for example, durable solutions policy or strategy development. Profiling exercises use different methodologies depending on the information needed and the context. The actors involved, they jointly agree on objectives for the profiling and then determine the methodology to address the objectives. Profiling typically utilizes a mixed methods approach to capture different types of data and triangulate findings from one source with others. When possible, profiling aims to provide statistically representative information of the target populations acquired through an anonymous sample-based household survey. So the survey can also include sections on individual level data for each member of the household, and then the quantitative data is complemented with focus group discussions and key informant interviews to provide more insight to the survey findings. As mentioned, profiling uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods at either household or individual level, as well as community level, to provide data disaggregated by location, sex, age, and diversity. So diversity could mean a range of things depending on what is relevant in each context. Examples could be religion or ethnicity. The core is usually a household survey which can collect data at household or individual levels. The ensuing analysis can be enriched through focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and a review of secondary data, as well as, for example, service or infrastructure mapping, resulting in a comprehensive urban profile of the displacement-affected populations and the local infrastructure and policy environment they face. You can also use some of these qualitative methods before you conduct a household survey to inform the development of the data collection tools. Displaced populations often face specific challenges in regard to issues such as securing housing and livelihoods or ensuring community support and building social networks. However, in many displacement-affected urban contexts, non-displaced people also live in similar conditions, facing very similar challenges. Profiling aims to understand the realities of the various types of communities and population groups living in the same urban area through a comparative analysis. This will allow policymakers and practitioners to gain an understanding of the similarities of different population groups in order to identify synergies in programming, as well as their differences, such as specific displacement-related needs, in order to inform targeted responses. An example could be from a recent profiling exercise in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. The findings showed that there was not a great difference between the short-term basic needs of displaced and non-displaced populations. But the exception was that the displaced population often didn't have rental agreements, whereas this challenge was faced less frequently by the non-displaced population. However, profiling is not limited to just collecting data. It comprises a sequence of interlinked steps, beginning with consensus building around the need for profiling and ending with the validations of findings by the profiling partners and target populations themselves, and then the wide dissemination of results. And we work to achieve this by bringing different partners, including central and local authorities, humanitarian and development actors, together. In other words, profiling is a collaborative process based on principles of transparency and ethical considerations, and it actively promotes the buy-in of partner organizations and the government at all stages. This collaborative process ensures that collected data is widely accepted and used, and this will reduce the need for multiple parallel resource-heavy surveys. And that helps to ensure that actors working in the same urban setting also share a common understanding of the displacement situation in the urban context. So the development of profiling methodology and data collection tools is a collaborative and context-specific process implemented by the different stakeholders working in the country or urban area where the data is collected. And due to the consultative nature of the profiling process at each step, the time frame of conducting a profiling exercise is usually several months. The group of actors leading a profiling exercise typically includes members of central and local governments, national and international NGOs, and UN partners working in humanitarian and development fields. Local technical expertise, for example, through the National Statistics Office, will serve to ensure compatibility of the profiling methodology with other existing population data sources, such as a recent census. As a locally owned and implemented process, in addition to an enhanced understanding of the displacement situation in the urban area, increased local capacity and established collaborative work processes are key outcomes of a profiling exercise. An inclusive approach to each stage of the profiling exercise, which could include development of objectives, methodology, data collection tools, and analysis and recommendations. This is especially key in contexts where the sought-after information is highly politicized or there is no consensus on existing data and information on the displacement situation. Profiling thus contributes to durable solutions to displacement through forming an evidence base for decision-making. Displaced people, like all migrants, bring with them particular skills, experience, and networks which can benefit the host families and communities into which they move, and if tapped into, form the foundation for durable solutions. In addition to vulnerabilities, profiling sheds light on the range of experiences, needs, and capacities of the displaced, their host families, and their non-displaced neighbours in urban settings. Through looking into the future aspirations, plans, and decision-making criteria of the displaced communities themselves, profiling also forms a basis for a forward-looking response, even in volatile contexts. Profiling findings are validated and disseminated among the profiling partners, wider group of stakeholders, and the target populations. And this is through an inclusive, methodologically transparent, and sound approach. A profiling exercise then aims to secure wide acceptance of the results and their use as a starting point for responses. For example, in the case study we're going to be talking about in Hargeisa, the results of the profiling are intended to inform an action plan to implement the Somaliland IDP policy, which the government of Somaliland would soon adopt. So, we've talked about profiling, and now we can look a little bit more specifically about profiling in urban contexts. So why are humanitarian responses different in urban contexts? Well, urban contexts pose particular challenges to actors responding to displacement situations. Identifying the displaced and displacement-affected people and collecting data on them is, well, it's difficult. So just responding with a status-based approach, for instance, because certain populations are identified as IDPs or refugees, can cause tensions within communities. And they can also provide services which do not necessarily meet and reflect the specific needs of the populations. For example, in one urban context, one agency that JIPS is currently working with had been providing assistance to IDPs without recognizing that actually the host population was in fact more vulnerable, and this was due to a lack of data. They just didn't have the right information on this. So we're now working with them to understand the situation of all the different population groups in that context to design a more targeted response. So people generally move to urban areas because of the services, the infrastructure, and the jobs already in place there. So it's important to map those providers to design complementary programs. Additionally, urban contexts might call for more comprehensive approaches to humanitarian development interventions to support durable solutions to displacement. In other words, while in rural or camp settings, humanitarian actors may be the dominant service providers, in urban contexts, by contrast, strengthening the capacity of the existing infrastructure becomes necessary to serve the needs of the population as a whole. So before we talk about the technical process and related urban challenges, we'd like to talk about the collaborative aspects in urban contexts in a bit more detail. In addition to the obvious reasons of coordinating to save resources, the responses to urban displacement often involve quite a large group of actors that in addition to humanitarian actors would include local authorities and development actors with expertise on urban planning and from various different sectoral backgrounds. As mentioned, urban areas often have systems that can provide for citizens' needs, or at least the potential for this, including infrastructure, social services, housing, markets, and employment opportunities. And these are provided by a range of different actors. And as a result of conflict or a disaster, or as a result of significant migration flows, these systems can be weakened, and to effectively respond to urban displacement crises and to tap into the opportunities that urban contexts also bring about, we need to understand these urban systems more comprehensively. And this is never something that one actor has the capacity to do, which is why it's always recommended to include a wide range of different actors in the process of urban profiling. So to illustrate the profiling process, we'd like to share with you a profiling exercise in Hargeisa that we supported. The findings are not yet out yet, but it's an exercise that's been going on for a little bit of time. And to give you some background, Hargeisa is the capital of Somaliland. It's a self-declared republic that is internationally recognized as an autonomous region of Somalia. And it hosts various different population groups that have migrated to the city either by choice or being forced to do so as a result of conflict, insecurity, or disasters. Over the last few decades, internally displaced people from Somaliland or south-central Somalia and refugee returnees from Ethiopia and from elsewhere, and economic migrants have been arriving to the city where they live in the same areas as host populations. So existing data on displacement-affected populations was limited, both in terms of geographic scope, usually focusing on selected settlements, and also around objectives, so mainly focusing on needs to inform immediate programming plans. And no attempt had been made to systematically identify the different population types, so for example, displaced or non-displaced, in a context where people with varying migration histories and the urban poor population are mixed. Additionally, no systematically collected or analyzed data existed on the displaced populations that live outside of the recognized settlements. And because of this, the partners working in Hargeisa decided to initiate an urban profiling exercise. So in Hargeisa, the profiling exercise was carried out by a profiling task force with leadership from UNHCR and the Somaliland Ministry of Repatriation, Rehabilitation and Reconstruction. That is the body responsible for IDPs and refugees, in addition to local and international NGOs and other agencies. And JIPS provided technical support to the profiling partners throughout the process. So central to the profiling approach was the engagement and participation of key target groups and stakeholders in Somaliland, including IDP committees present in the settlements, local leaders, government and development actors, so that the findings and policy recommendations put forward as part of this exercise are expected to be representative of these stakeholders' views and will be realistic to implement. So compared to camp or rural contexts, in urban settings, developing a profiling methodology is often complicated by a number of issues. So the first one is the lack of formal sources of information, particularly if many people, so both displaced and host, live in informal settlements. It can be difficult to get an overall understanding on where and how many people there are. There are often no maps, no lists of buildings, no street names, or clear definitions of settlement boundaries. And since national censuses often omit informal settlements, there is little idea of population size or profile. So just to give you a little example from Hargeisa, this is the only map that the UNHCR office had on the urban area of Hargeisa when we started to work on the profiling. So secondly, expense and difficulty of conducting a survey. Informal settlements pose a range of logistical and security problems, including complicated and inefficient sampling given the lack of proper baselines. A third challenge is the lack of validity and gaps in responses. In informal settlements, the data quality problems associated with surveys carried out by external agencies are amplified. And confronted by outsiders asking questions, people, especially IDPs or refugees, they can feel threatened, especially if they fear eviction or are engaged in illegal activities, or if they're in the city illegally, as in countries, say, for instance, with refugee encampment policies. And if respondents are uncertain about the purpose of the survey and how the data will be used, they are unlikely to provide full answers. So in informal settlements, there is the added complication also of housing tenure. So if the survey is seen to be part of a process to legalize tenure, both landlords and tenants, they'll feel threatened. Fourth point is that urban environments have complex social structures. So this makes it difficult to know who to partner and work with to ensure that the data will be used. And this also makes it difficult to know who to involve and communicate with in order to ensure that we have access to the targeted populations. In urban contexts, it's often more difficult to figure out who the gatekeepers might be and how we can deal with them. So in Hargeisa, we face this problem of access, and we need to gain the trust of communities for enumerators to enter certain areas. And one way to gain access was to build relationships with people that held informal leadership positions based on local social hierarchies. And in the settlements, it was easy to identify these leaders because of the committees that were set up to represent the communities. But in the urban areas, identifying these entry points to the communities was much more difficult. And so to overcome this barrier, a lot more time was needed to meet with different people and just to know who to talk to. So the final challenge we would like to highlight would be the need for a shared understanding of profiling. So communicating well the purpose of a profiling exercise to the targeted communities is key, and that's for three reasons. One would be if the process is able to communicate well that the exercise is not directly linked to any assistance, then data quality can be much higher, as people are less likely to exaggerate their needs. The other thing is in terms of managing expectations, so it's really important to be clear on the purpose of the exercise to avoid creating expectations that cannot be met through the process. And the final point would be reaching the populations that are harder to reach might sometimes require extensive communications. So, for example, even a public information campaign where you might discuss profiling on the radio or something like that to encourage these populations to participate. So we'll now go more in depth into two of the most complex methodological issues for urban contexts, and that's mapping and sampling strategies. And then we'll finish with a few words about using qualitative methods in profiling. So sometimes obtaining an overview of the situation is not easy, and this can be because of the low level of existing information on target populations, including their numbers and locations. So more specifically, in large cities, displaced people, so it could be refugees, asylum seekers, or IDPs, as a proportion of the total population is usually very low, and different target groups can have different distribution patterns within the same city. And even if registration systems exist, many people, so-called invisible refugees, might not be registered in urban settings, and if they are, the location of households is often outdated due to mobility of the population. And in most cases of internal displacement, there's no registration in urban areas, or it's community-based and highly incomplete. And thus, there's no frame from which to draw your sample. Third point would be that national census data and maps of the city are often outdated or inaccurate and tend to exclude informal settlements. However, if a recent census has been conducted, this can provide a useful starting point, and it's well worth the trouble of engaging with the National Statistics Office or census agency. In urban contexts, profiling processes usually start with comprehensive target population mapping. Sounds fancy? Well, it is. It's a process that combines existing population data with information collected through local key informants and community or neighborhood level mapping. And this sometimes time-consuming and, if we're honest, resource-heavy process serves to ensure that the profiling is representative of the populations it is targeting. And it's a valuable output on its own through producing a map of the locations and densities of different population groups in an urban area. So it's really worth investing the time in doing this. Just to clarify, when we at JIPS talk about mapping, we rarely actually talk about GIS or even actual maps. What we mean is consolidating information on the locations and numbers and/or concentrations of populations that we are interested to study in our profiling into one consolidated and agreed upon table. And not that type of table, this type of table. So mapping target populations starts with the obvious, but often in reality overlooked step of consolidating existing data on the locations and numbers of target populations. This process is often challenging and takes some time for a number of reasons. A lack of up-to-date data sources, contradicting and disputed information, and poor metadata, which makes it difficult to assess the usability of existing data. In urban context, data is often quickly out of date as people, both the displaced and others, tend to move frequently. Often, primary data collection is needed to complement existing data sources. And this means a combination of qualitative mapping, or trying to figure out where people are based on information from key informants, and through focus group discussions, which will produce estimations that support the targeting of a household survey or other data collection, and/or an enumeration, which is basically trying to count all households or individuals in a certain area. If we put this together, it can help us to get a more rigorous baseline that can inform more complicated and targeted sampling approaches. If we go back to the Hargeisa example, the purpose of the profiling was to understand the difference between population groups living in the urban areas, including IDPs coming from different parts of Somalia, refugees and asylum seekers, and economic migrants, as well as the urban host population. In order to draw conclusions on these different populations, we needed a sampling approach that was representative of each of the target populations. And this required a detailed map on which to base our sample. So we started the mapping process with a review of the existing data from the local authorities, baselines, as well as assistance and distribution data from humanitarian partners. However, this highlighted discrepancies in figures and locations for settlement populations. And so in order to fill in the knowledge gap and ensure that all settlements existing in the city were included in the profiling team conducted meetings with organizations and community groups. And through talking to community focal points, such as imams, elders, teachers, and community organization leaders, the profiling team was able to map the main locations and numbers for IDPs from south-central Somalia who were living out of settlements and who were previously not included on any of the lists. So after the desk review of existing data and these consultations, the profiling partners realized that in order to get reliable population figures from the profiling and an accurate breakdown of each of the target populations, an enumeration was necessary, and this meant a full count of the households of all the settlements identified in the mapping phase. So part of the enumeration involved identifying the household's migration status through a short series of questions, and these questions reflected a definition of each target group that had been agreed upon through a collaborative process between all the partners. At a very early stage in a comparative study, it's critical to ensure that all actors agree on who are the target groups and how they are defined, because otherwise it's a mess and your findings might not be accepted at the end. So I mentioned earlier that one of the key elements of a profiling exercise is a household survey, and JIPS usually uses a sample-based approach for the household survey, and this means that we don't interview everyone, but instead we select a subgroup of the population to be interviewed to reveal characteristics and trends. And this allows us to draw conclusions and can sometimes be representative of the different population groups. And it's particularly challenging to get a representative sample in an urban setting because of the mapping difficulties that we've just been talking about. So why go for sampling rather than full coverage? Well, first of all, it saves resources with fewer people being asked, but at the same time, it allows us to ask more questions and dive deeper into issues we want to understand, as we can then include more questions around the issues we want to cover. So generally, using a sample-based approach can help us reduce a lot of the data quality issues, so what we might call non-sampling errors, that relate to large-scale data collection exercises. And this includes problems with managing big teams of data collectors. For example, difficulty in finding large numbers of skilled people and training all of them enough on the tool, or errors introduced to the exercise because of respondents maybe misunderstanding the tool. And this can be reduced by making sure the data collectors have sufficient time to spend with each interviewee. So sampling is also a protection-sensitive approach, where we're not collecting people's names or contact details, and the answers given are delinked from the respondent's identity. So choosing a sample-based approach can be the only way, actually, of getting information on the hidden or hiding populations in urban contexts. And in urban settings, it usually does not really make sense to collect data that aims to cover each and every individual or household anyway. A sample-based approach allows us to add more elements to the study to compare different population groups, which can give us a valuable, comprehensive analysis of the situation. So profiling through a sample-based approach is also effective for informing decision-making in urban contexts to decide where to focus responses and what kind of vulnerabilities and coping mechanisms to address. So, for example, to develop criteria for which households to target based on actual evidence. So, given the challenges of locating where people are, sampling approaches in urban contexts might be quite complicated, and the sampling design will vary for each urban context. So in some cases, traditional probabilistic sampling strategies might not capture sufficient numbers of IDPs to enable statistical analysis. So the sampling approach has to be tailored to the distribution of the target populations, and sometimes different sampling techniques are required actually within the same urban setting. One method might be what we call a purposive sample, such as snowball sampling, which is basically done through referral. So, for example, in Quito, where we worked, the Colombian refugee population was dispersed throughout the city. So we went to find Colombian refugees and then just asked them to refer us to other Colombian refugees. So purposive methodologies, such as snowballing, present problems of bias because you're only interviewing people who know each other. For example, by asking people for referrals, you may only capture a wealthier social network or a population group and miss more vulnerable households. Because not everyone has the same probability of being selected for the survey, you have no idea how representative your sample is, and the conclusions need to be drawn accordingly. That said, it's often the only way to identify additional households to be interviewed in the case of small and hidden populations. So to avoid bias in this and to ensure an appropriate selection for households, it's actually best to identify entry point households in as random a way as possible. And for example, you could do this by throwing computer-generated global positioning system points on the mapped areas, and then randomly selecting from the list, so GPS points, or using systematic randomization such as population proportional to size, if you have recent census data available in the mapped areas. So that helps to avoid a little bit of the bias. So we don't always have to do purposive sampling. If reliable mapping data is available, we can choose a sample that will allow us to get representative information on the population groups by doing a random selection of households within each population group. So this was the case in Hargeisa. Thanks to the detailed enumeration data that we collected, we were able to choose from a representative sample for each of the population groups, and in the end, the findings from this data can be generalized for those population groups. By contrast, with purposive sampling, you can't generalize the findings and you can't measure the error, but the findings are still useful for making recommendations. So the choice of your sampling method is related to how representative of the true population you need your findings to be, and thus these decisions should be taken collaboratively, with all partners informed about the implications of the choice of the methodology design. Just a few words about qualitative methods. Qualitative data can be collected at various points of the profiling process. In Hargeisa, the exercise used a lot of key informant interviews and focus group discussions at the beginning during the mapping phase. But the planned focus group discussions to complement the survey data analysis never took place due to limited resources and the short time frame for finalizing the analysis. Generally, in urban contexts, qualitative methods from service mapping or community-based methods to understand community interactions can actually provide rich and useful data that complements target population-specific data. So, for example, in Delhi, a storyboard technique was used to understand experiences of different refugee populations and host communities' experiences of discrimination, harassment, and other themes that are difficult to meaningfully capture in surveys. So the profiling report from Hargeisa has not yet been validated, but the initial findings revealed actually that there were fewer differences between the population groups than we originally anticipated. And this generally signaled that the response to displacement in this area would need a strong emphasis on development outcomes to alleviate poverty and vulnerabilities for the population as a whole. So we now come to the end of the presentation part of this webinar, and I'll just quickly summarize some key points before we move on to question and answer. So some of the main points to summarize is that, firstly, profiling is helpful in urban contexts for comparing different population groups to facilitate more targeted responses. Defining the population groups at the outset of a profiling exercise is crucial for having agreed upon findings later. Mapping, as we've defined it, is worth investing in because it allows us to design a sampling approach that can better represent the characteristics of the population groups. Sampling is an appropriate strategy for urban contexts because of the logistical challenges of enumerating and finding entire population groups. Using a mixed methods approach, such as by combining sample-based survey data with qualitative data, such as focus group discussions or some participatory approaches, is a way of obtaining information that takes into account the complexity of urban systems. And this helps us to explore particular findings in depth, but also to have a broader picture. And in some cases, profiling may be the only way of getting information on hidden populations. So profiling in urban contexts, though logistically challenging, can produce methodologically sound data, and this can inform decision-making for assistance programs or the drafting of policies. The users of this information could be NGOs, UN agencies, or the government. And investing in such an exercise can be expensive and time-consuming, especially given the collaborative approach, where we've got to get all these different actors on board to agree on the objectives and the methodologies, and that can be very time-consuming and difficult to do. But the results can mean a shared agreement on the displacement situation, and this in turn makes the alignment of programming and policy between the different actors, between governments, humanitarian and development actors, much easier to do the alignment in the long run. So it's a very important thing to do, and let's do it. Okay, so that was it from my presentation. What we'll do is we'll hand over to my colleagues, Laura Ronkainen and Damien Giselle, and also Kadra from DRC and Somalia, to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Would anyone online have any questions? At this point, you can either type or speak, I think. If you just indicate by raising your hand, you can click the hand button that you can see on the chat box.
Laura, I have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Sylvia is asking, how can you involve local authorities in this profiling exercise?
Maybe, do we have other questions? We could take a few and then try to answer them as a whole. I see there's another question from Claudia saying, hi, how do you collate data when you do the baseline assessment? Do you use any specific software to help you get through all of the data? That's a very good question. Anything else from participants?
I do see a hand raised. Margrit, I see your hand raised. I will unmute you now. Margrit, can you speak to us? Okay, apparently not, so please just put your question in the chat box if you have issues with your mic.
Okay, maybe while we're waiting for the question to appear on the chat box, we can already tackle the few that were put forward. So maybe I'll hand over to Damien to first respond to the mapping question. Or the baseline assessment question, and then we'll move to the involvement of local authorities.
Thank you, Claudia, for that question. I'm quite a fan of having fairly easy software that can be used actually by most people. So I usually advise not to get into too technical database software or data collection software and stay with simply stay with Excel. Particularly when you're doing your mapping, you want something that is actually quite easy to read for every actor who is actually inputting this mapping exercise. Because you will need also to share this mapping exercise with different partners so that they can input, they can give their knowledge of the field. So a simple Excel usually would do for the mapping itself. Now, if you're talking of the data collection itself, the broader exercise, we tend to advise to use more and more mobile data collection because it's actually much easier and much faster, and also more and more less resource consuming. So we would use also mobile data collection, but still the analysis would happen on Excel. So it will depend on the capacities that you have also in the field. If you have someone who's able to handle more complicated data software, you might rely on them to help you in the technicalities. But if you do not have these capacities in the field, it's actually usually much easier and faster to simply rely on Excel, for instance.
Okay. And maybe on the involvement of authorities, local authorities or national authorities. I would say generally the way we work is in the very beginning of a profiling exercise. quite a lot of time and effort is invested in identifying through a stakeholder mapping the key users of the data, the key people and organizations, actors that need to be involved in developing the methodology and implementing the process, so that they will then find the data useful in the end. And of course, the local authorities would be a key actor in urban contexts. And so, usually, to lead the exercise, it's not a one agency process or one consultant process, but it's a collaborative exercise among the different end users of the data, and there would usually is some sort of a coordination group that is set up for this purpose. And generally what we advise is very much involving the local authorities in leading the discussions in that kind of a group. And I would maybe like to ask Khadra if you would like to say a few words about how the local government was involved in the Hargeisa profiling exercise, just to give a concrete example.
Hi, thanks, Laura. As Laura suggested, when this exercise was kicked off, MRRR, the agency mandated for IDPs, was a key part of the profiling task force and was actually co-chair. So we had them attend all the profiling task force meetings. They would start by opening the meetings and all the rest of it. We had regular meetings to also update them as the profiling core team that was working on it. And then what we also did during the mapping, enumeration, and the household survey, we had MRRR staff involved in supervising and being out with us in the field, so that they could feel ownership. In Hargeisa, it worked actually quite well. In one of the settlements we were working in, State House, we had an issue with the camp committee stopping the exercise, and we referred it back to MRRR, and the deputy minister got involved, and they were able to resolve it. And by having them in the field and having them so involved, it allowed them to have greater faith in the data. As we've highlighted, the data hasn't been validated. It will be validated this Sunday, and they'll be involved in the validation process, of course, and any recommendations that come out of it.
Great. Thank you, Khadra. There was a question from Carolina asking what type of questions are suitable for focus group discussions and which ones do you include in the survey or questionnaire? And I'll pass that over to Damien, perhaps to react to.
Mm-hmm. You need to know first who your questionnaire is going to target. If your questionnaire is targeting the individual or the household, you will want to ask questions that relate directly to the household. And you will want to avoid having questions that are a bit too broad and that should be answered not only by an individual but maybe by a whole community. A questionnaire might also, depending on the questions, be more relevant if you're asking some protection questions that in a focus group we might not be able to ask. It might also be the contrary. You might be able to ask some other protection-related questions, like a question on discrimination of some ethnic groups. You might want to discuss that at the community level. Everything related to the network, the social networks in the city, the interactions between different groups might be interesting to have that at focus group level, because you will want to look at the interaction that you create when you ask this question. Overall, it's a question of can you ask that question to an individual? Would it make sense to ask that question to an individual? Or is it more interesting to get a broader discussion around the topic that you want to have? Usually at the beginning of your profiling exercise, you're discussing and you're agreeing on some themes and topics that you would like to look at. When you discuss this theme, you already have to kind of think where would this best be answered. So this is at this moment that you need to think about it.
Thank you, Damien. Another question came in relation to the sort of broader use of profiling, asking, is it possible to do a profiling which is focused on durable solutions or livelihood opportunities? I would again say broadly, and I will then ask Kata to maybe give an example from Hargeisa again, but broadly, as a process, it's very well suited for this kind of more longer term planning and analysis that is sort of steered towards more in-depth analysis of the situation. For example, for durable solutions planning, because profiling allows us to get quite a good overview of the situation of different populations in a certain area, and to understand sort of the vulnerabilities and the struggles that they might have, but also the opportunities that are there for working towards durable solutions. And maybe, Katra, if you want to speak a few words about Hargeisa and how durable solutions and livelihood opportunities were analyzed in the profiling.
Okay, yeah, sure thing. Initially with the Hargeisa profiling, we actually placed our entire questionnaire and set up on the Ask guidelines for durable solutions, so all our indicators, themes, and as a result, the questionnaire was based on that, with the idea that we would want to have, to be able to assess to what extent the different groups have reached their durable solutions and what the obstacles or, capacities for them to reach it would be. And within that, then we just measured all of the key indicators agreed upon during the profiling task force. We agreed on certain indicators and themes, and all of those were measured for all 3 target groups and cross-compared. And that allows us to see, to what extent what are the certain obstacles or what indicators are stopping these target groups from having reached durable solutions.
Thank you. The next one is a little bit more specific to urban violence or urban context in Latin America that have a high prevalence of violence. It's coming from Pablo, asking regarding urban violence context, as for instance in favelas, comunas, or slums in Latin America, a lot of people suffer from intra-urban forced displacement inside the city. How is it possible to profile or sample in these cases where the actor that caused the violence is so close? And that's a very, very good question. There's actually a profiling exercise that was just completed in Honduras, and the report was launched, I think, yesterday or the day before in country. We're hoping to be able to put it up on our website as soon as possible as well. Looking exactly at this, displacement induced by violence, and the methodology, I think, was quite complicated because the issue was very sensitive. It was quite challenging to find the people to be interviewed that had been displaced because of violence. And there we very much worked with local civil society networks, people that know and interact with the communities a lot. The church was one of the key informants for the profiling exercise there, to help us identify areas where people had been moving to and where we might need to go to do a little bit more community level mapping. The whole process, the data collection, was carried out through a local NGO who knew the areas quite well, but it still made the fieldwork was challenging, and there were a lot of security issues to be considered, even just for the data collectors to enter the communities and do data collection on the ground. So it wasn't easy, but in the end we managed to get, I would say, quite a good overview of the displacement situation in the country due to urban violence. Maybe I would say, I'm not sure exactly when are we able to put up the report, but I would say in a couple of weeks, hopefully, you can find the report on our website to get a little bit more information on that if you're interested. We had another question on how many profiling exercises have we conducted and where. and are there others that are using our methodology to conduct other profiling exercises? I would generally say a key thing to know about JIPS is that we're not an implementing organization. So we're supporting country-led, country-implemented exercises in different contexts. We've been working in the past in Latin America, in different countries. I just mentioned Honduras. We've been working in Colombia for quite a while. We worked in Ecuador, in Quito. We've been working in different countries in Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Somalia, obviously were already mentioned, in DRC, in Burundi, in Uganda, a little bit in the MENA region as well. We were involved in Syria this year, actually a little bit an atypical process, I think, for JIT support, but still looking at displacement data. In Asia, we've been working in countries such as India and Myanmar. So all over the place, in Europe as well, in Serbia and Kosovo. So different countries request for our support. We work with different partners ranging from the government at the national and local levels to UN and NGO actors. In terms of the methodology, it's not a DIPS trademark. It's definitely based on different experiences working with different actors in different contexts. So there's not sort of one single or one-size-fits-all package that we use, but it's tailored each time according to the data needs and objectives in country. And yes, there are other actors that do profiling as well, so it doesn't necessarily mean that JIPS needs to be involved. But we're here to support. So the way we work is essentially we receive requests from the field to come and help out, to build capacity and fill gaps where that is needed in the country-owned processes.
Alfred is asking a question, which is there a scope for adapting the application tools and processes to make profiling more appropriate for emergency response context, or rapid emergency response context? JIPS is looking mostly at protracted displacement. So it is true that the methodology that is suggested also in our on our website and on the different methodology documents that we have is more tailored to protracted displacement, longer-term displacement, where you have a population that is a bit more fixed than in an emergency context. However, already the urban context itself is a great test, basically, because it's actually closer to an emergency context. There are a lot more displacement inside the city, and these displacements are usually quite fast. That being said, the methodology that you need to have when you're doing a profiling in an emergency response context needs definitely to be adapted, and probably you will need to give up on some of the methodology aspects that we suggest in more protracted displacements. You will need to probably rework a little bit on the sampling, rework a little bit on the methodology to target your population, and probably have shorter questionnaires than what we usually have. But this is we also are looking a little bit at that at the moment. We worked a little bit in the Middle East region lately, and this has been also a sort of test for us to see if those tools that we are usually using could be adapted a little bit to the emergency context, and we are looking at that at the moment.
Katra, would you like to comment on that from the Mogadishu experience, since you're now working on that?
Well, Mogadishu, it's, you know, even though over the last several years there's been some level of stability in the city, and we are dealing with protracted caseload of IDPs and other displaced communities in the city. We're also witnessing a situation where regular evictions take place, and the situations in certain parts of the city are very insecure and kind of emergency-like, and people are living. So we've had to adopt working with GIPS, adapt our methodology and approach to fit this, working in an insecure, very fluid environment. So we just did an enumeration, for example, but then some evictions have taken place just after the enumeration was completed. So setting up an approach that would allow us to be able to verify and adapt to the enumeration data to be able to take in line with the evictions that have taken place had to be adopted along with, an approach. It affected our sampling approach now. We have to take in a lot of considerations with the best and most effective way to do a sampling in a city as complex as this. So, yeah, I think Mogadishu has also been interesting for GIPS and for us in that sense.
Yeah, definitely a very interesting project for GIPS. Another question came from Daniel asking, what mechanisms would you suggest to ensure the sustainability of profiling efforts? I'm understanding this question from two perspectives, and I hope at least one of them responds to your question. So first of all, in terms of the usability of the data, how do we make sure that after all the work, the data that comes out of the exercise is useful and used? In our experience in different contexts, the collaborative approach to collecting data and involving different actors in shaping the exercise is definitely key in this, both from the perspective of making sure that the questions that we ask, the indicators that we use, make sense to the people that are intended to use the data, but also to make sure that people can agree on the way of collecting data that was used to then also accept the findings in the end. From another point of view, in terms of sustainability, we definitely, the way we work always aims to build capacity in country and with the partners that work on the profiling exercise with us, so that subsequent profiling exercises or other data collection activities that take place can then benefit from the experiences that we went through together. So that's definitely a strong emphasis in our work, in addition to actually helping partners collect data and developing tools, is to build capacity on data collection and working on joint profiling exercises on the ground. There's one more question coming from Leah asking, how do you ensure best practice data collection practices when using a range of partners and or enumerators? And I'm going to hand over to Damien for that.
I think it's all in the collaborative process. It's all about making sure that from the start, from the moment you start talking about the data collection, from the moment you're looking at the questionnaire that you're going to have, you are involving all the relevant stakeholders that are going to be also involved in the data collection field work itself. So the questionnaire that you're developing should not be something developed on your own. It should be something developed and validated by the stakeholders you're working with, which means you usually should work under a working group, a profiling working group, so that you have your validation group that is always here to help you. And then training. I mean, training of the enumerators, training of the person that are going to the field to ensure that they have the same understanding of the questions is of course the key to make sure that your data collection is done well, and that you have as less as possible cleaning to do when the database arrives. You always need, of course, someone to supervise the whole data collection field work, and you also should make sure that your data collected are entered in one single place. And then, of course, once the data collection is done, make sure that the analysis itself is a process. Make sure that you're starting to analyze the data with the partners already, and it will, of course, make the validation of the whole work later on much easier.
Perhaps just to add to that, at JIPS, since we are involved in various different contexts and various different kind of actors collecting data from actual data collection experts such as national statistics offices to actors whose speciality is actually in something completely different, but who sort of need to jump into it every once in a while because data is needed and actors might not be present who are specialized in that. What we have been trying to do is globally collect best practices, good practices, I would say, things that work, and standardize them into tools and approaches to profiling. You can find more information on that on our website. We have what we call the JETS, the JIPS Essential Toolkit, which is a collection of profiling tools and methodology guidance that we found to be useful in different contexts when it's adapted, obviously, but sort of as a general guideline also for a little bit of quality control. So sort of it's a good starting point. We have the PARC, which is I would say an online compendium of different kind of questionnaires, reports, methodology documents from different actors in different countries, from also various kinds of assessment and profiling exercises. You can go online and have a look to see what others have done. That one is not just JIPS supported exercises, but from a broad group of people and actors. We developed this part together with our partner organization ACAS. So this is a good starting point also for looking at sort of how other people solve problems. We also invest a lot in capacity building, as was already mentioned, and part of that is our training, the profiling coordination training, which is steered towards building different partners' capacity to coordinate and lead collaborative profiling exercises on the ground. So it takes participants through the profiling process and tries to see or build the capacity of the participants to oversee an exercise with different partners involved on the ground. You can also have a look at the DART, the Dynamic Analysis and Reporting tool that we're working on. We just launched it last year and we're now working on improving it, which puts online data sets from different profiling exercises that have been conducted in different countries, and through a very sort of user-driven approach lets you analyze and explore data live to see what came out of different profiling exercises. It's an easy access point to data analysis because it doesn't need for the users to be able to use SPSS or even Excel. That was just to mention a few things that you can find on our website. There's yet another question in the chat box saying, from what I understand from this webinar, profiling sounds like a tedious and expensive exercise. Is there any criteria used in choosing the area to profile? So who decides, the government, the UN, the NGOs, that an area needs to have a profiling exercise done? It's a very good question. From JIPS perspective, we always react to requests from the ground that are based on a clearly identified or concrete need for profiling. Now, how do we know that an area needs profiling? It's essentially it comes from different actors, and usually there is, if there's one actor on the ground that thinks the profiling would be pertinent, there are others as well who find that there are gaps in the analysis, or that a collaborative exercise might be useful to get a broader or better understanding of the situation. Ideally, this decision would be taken by the different actors that were also mentioned in the question together, so everyone who would use the data in the end. Now, sometimes that, of course, there's one or two actors that lead the process a little bit more, and then advocacy is required to bring others on board to participate. But the way we work and the way we've seen profiling to be most impactful is when there's a broader group of people that are involved, or actors that are involved, and that work together and have identified the need for profiling together. Another question came from Elham asking, during the profiling process, is it necessary to apply some standard indicators such as AHDM in the questionnaire? Generally, I would say no, not necessarily standard indicators. It always depends on the objectives that are identified for the exercise. We've been working a lot in different contexts. We've been working a lot on exercises that have been looking at durable solutions analysis, or looking at sort of more longer term planning needs of different actors in protracted displacement situations particularly. So we've been working quite a lot on indicators for profiling that can help in this kind of analysis, durable solutions analysis or longer term planning. So we have some starting points, or sort of their guidance on how to do that, and we're actually at the moment working at the global level with a wide group of different actors on a project led by the Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of IDPs on developing sort of a library of indicators that can help actors on the ground analyze displacement situations from a durable solutions perspective, particularly focusing on durable solutions for IDPs. But in general, I wouldn't say that there is a need to use standard indicators. It's more about best practice in terms of how to disaggregate data. You mentioned AGDM. I'm not sure what you mean exactly by that. Age, gender, I'm guessing, diversity, and something else. But that's definitely something that we advocate for. Usually profiling data would include core data, what we call core data, so age, thank you, age, gender, diversity, mainstreaming was the acronym. So we definitely usually advocate for data at a minimum to be disaggregated, or to be able to be disaggregated by age, gender, and diversity, whatever diversity in different contexts might mean. And in addition to that, to look at where people are, locations of displaced populations, and their distribution geographically, because that often is a quite concrete piece of information that helps programming. I hope that answered the question. Are there any other questions that we've either omitted or that you would still like to put forward to us? I think on my list, I feel like we've covered the ones that are up there, but I might have missed something. If nothing else from participants' side, I'd like to thank you all for your participation and for your questions. And you can find more information on different profiling exercises that we've supported in different countries on our website. There's a map that can take you through to different country pages. And you can also find us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn if you'd like to follow us. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you would like to discuss profiling plans in your country context as well. We're always happy to have a chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much for this great session. I think it has been most comprehensive in the subject. And as I said, the session was recorded, so if you want to recall anything that was covered during this afternoon, you will have the chance to do that. We need a few days to process the recording, but I guess latest next Monday, Tuesday, it will be published on www.urbangoodpractices.org. This is the website maintained by the Urban Refugee Task Team. So you will have this recording posted there along with all the other webinars that we have been doing in the past 2 years. Actually, this is the 9th one, so you can find all that up there. If there are no more questions, thank you very much for being here. Emmanuel, Laura, anything else from your side? If not, then we can close this session.
Nothing more from our side. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.